Welcome to part 8, adding Plotly figures to the dashboard. So Plotly figures cannot be added to the dashboard directly. You have to use this dcc.graph component and set the figure parameter to the Plotly figure. Now before we do this, we're going to change the layout of our application so that it uses a CSS grid. We're going to create a 2x2 grid where the data tables are on the left, the graphs are on the upper right, and the maps are on the bottom right. So if you recall from the HTML and CSS chapter, you do this by creating a div, that will be the container. This will be the outer div. You change its display to grid, and then you use this grid template areas property and set it equal to rows of quoted text. So each row represents a single row in the grid. So this is 2 rows. And then the columns are determined by the words that are separated by spaces. So we have 2 words over here separated by spaces, so that means there are 2 columns. So the individual words or over here are labels for each particular area in the grid. So the tables area represents 2 portions, the upper left and bottom left portion of the grid. The graphs area name is the upper right, and the maps area is the bottom right. Okay, so let's take a look at how this looks with code. So first of all, we're going to create our graph component and set it equal to the first figure that we created in the last video. Now each individual object has to have this grid area property in its CSS mapping to that particular area of the grid. So we're going to say, hey, this graph, put it in the graphs area, which will be in the upper right hand corner of the dashboard. The table tabs, which we created in a previous video, we can change the style property like this. We can just set it as an attribute. We'll say, hey, these table tabs will go on the left side. They're going to take up both of these, the entire left-hand side of the grid. We haven't created the maps yet. We'll do that in the future. So here's our container. It's a div that contains the table tabs and this cumulative graph object, which we just created. We're going to set this style. So this is our container. So the display will be grid. Here are the grid template areas, which we created in a single line like this. So it's just 2 rows of quoted text. To set the column width of each column, you can use this grid template columns property, and we're going to set them equal to be 50% of the viewport. So each one will be 50% of the viewable screen. They'll cut it right in the middle. And here's a property column gap, which allows you to separate the left column from the right column, or actually all of the columns by some particular number. Here we're going to separate them by 10 pixels so they're not laying right next to one another. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the outcome here. So here's our dashboard now. On the left-hand side, we have our data tables and really the tabs that contain the data tables. On the right-hand side, we have our graph. So here's cumulative for Texas. Now, we can change to a different graph, say the daily graph, by changing or setting it equal to the next figure in the list. So that's perfectly good. Now, instead of setting it manually, we're going to actually use tabs to hold all 3 graphs. So we're going to use 3 tabs, one for cumulative, one for daily, and one for weekly. So let's pop down here. And so we're going to use tabs. And before that, we will create each figure as a graph object. So figure 0, 1, and 2 in the list, and we'll give it an appropriate ID. So we'll save each of those to some variable. Then we're going to create individual tabs using that create tab function that we created in a previous video. We use this for the data tables, but here the content will be the graph object. So we're going to say, all right, let's make a tab of the cumulative graph, a tab of the daily graph, and a tab of the weekly graph, and then give it a label and a value that makes sense. And finally, we need that tabs, that dcc.tabs component to get all of the individual tabs as the content. So we do that. We give it, set it some values. The default will be cumulative. And then we have to set it, then the style of this. So these are the tabs that we actually, place on our dashboard. And we're going to say, hey, all of you tabs go on the graphs area of the grid. like that. And then we have our container, which is the same as before. And then we set the layout like that. And so finally we have our dashboard now, which has the data tables on the left. So we can click back and forth with the tabs. And then we have tabs for each one of the graphs like that. Okay, great. So that is how we add our graphs, our Plotly figures to our dashboard.